The darkness of the Arctic winter is not merely an absence of light. It is a physical weight. It presses against the thick iron rivets of the ship. It settles over the frozen planks of the main deck like a heavy blanket of deep, bruised navy and charcoal gray. If one were to draw this world, it would be rendered on a canvas of pure black, with only the softest, most hesitant strokes of chalky blue and muted slate to suggest the separation between the frozen sky and the frozen sea. There is no horizon. There is only the endless, crushing continuum of the cold. The ship, a massive construct of blackened steel and heavy timber, sits within this void not as a conqueror, but as an intruder, moving at a pace so glacial it barely registers as motion at all. In the heavy silence of the night, the only sound is the rhythmic, vibrating thrum of the coal engines, buried deep within the belly of the vessel. It is a low, constant hum, a heartbeat of fire encased in thousands of tons of freezing iron. The vibration travels up through the ribs of the ship, up through the frost-coated floorboards, and into the heavy leather boots of the captain. He stands in the center of the wheelhouse, a solitary figure rendered in shadows and the faint, dusty amber light of a single brass storm lantern. The light does not illuminate the room. It merely pushes back the darkness by a few timid inches, casting long, wavering silhouettes that stretch across the riveted walls like charcoal smudges on rough paper. The flame flickers, a tiny, fragile tongue of orange and pale yellow, feeding on the heavy oil, struggling against the pervasive chill that seeps through the thick glass panes of the windows. The captain does not move. To move is to expend warmth, and warmth is the most precious commodity in this desolate expanse. He is encased in layers of thick, unyielding wool. The collar of his greatcoat is turned up, burying his jaw and the lower half of his face in a scratchy, stiff embrace of dark navy fabric. The fabric is heavy, smelling of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and the ozone scent of the freezing air. Frost has settled upon his thick eyebrows and the edges of his mustache, tiny crystalline structures catching the faint amber light of the lantern, glittering like microscopic diamonds against the leathery, weather-beaten texture of his skin. Every breath he takes is a deliberate, measured act. He draws the freezing air in through his nose, feeling it burn a cold path down into his lungs, and releases it slowly through parted lips. The exhalation blossoms into the cabin as a thick, swirling plume of white vapor. It hangs there, suspended in the still air, a ghostly shape that slowly drifts and dissipates into the darker corners of the room, leaving behind a faint dampness that immediately freezes upon the polished wood of the binnacle. Below him, the bow of the icebreaker meets the ancient, impenetrable surface of the Arctic Ocean. There is no dramatic crash. There is only a slow, agonizing grind. The ship does not slice through the ice, it climbs onto it. The massive weight of the angled iron hull presses down upon the frozen white expanse, forcing the ice to bear the burden of the entire vessel. The sound is low, a deep, groaning resonance that reverberates through the bones. It is the sound of unimaginable pressure. The ice complains. It clicks. It cracks with the sharp, hollow report of a distant rifle shot, a sound that snaps across the flat, featureless plain and is swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness of the polar night. And then, with a slow, grinding sigh, the ice gives way. Great slabs of frozen seawater, thick as stone walls, fracture and tilt, forced down beneath the hull or pushed aside, scraping along the iron sides of the ship with a continuous, grating screech that becomes a hypnotic, endless lullaby. The captain watches this slow destruction through the thick, salt-stained glass of the wheelhouse window. The window pane is framed by deep, encroaching borders of white frost intricate fern-like patterns of ice crystals that creep inward from the brass frame, threatening to seal off the view entirely. He rubs a heavy, leather-gloved thumb against the glass, clearing a small circle. The leather squeaks softly against the cold pane. Through this narrow portal, the world outside is painted in variations of gray and blue. The sweeping beam of the ship's forward searchlight cuts a hazy, diffused cone of pale illumination through the falling snow. The snowflakes are not delicate flurries. They are hard, dry pellets of ice, driven horizontally by a relentless, moaning wind. They hiss as they strike the glass, a constant, whispering abrasion. The beam of light reveals the jumbled chaos of the pack ice. It is a landscape of profound desolation, rendered in the stark contrast of blinding white ridges and deep, bottomless shadows of pure black. The shadows stretch and distort as the ship inches forward, long, grasping fingers of darkness playing across the fractured terrain. The captain's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, trace the jagged lines of the pressure ridges. They look like the spine of some ancient, frozen beast, jutting up from the flat expanse. He knows the history of these waters. It is a history written in inches, measured by the slow consumption of coal and the steady, monotonous turning of the great brass chronometer on the wall behind him. The ticking of the clock is loud in the quiet moments between the groans of the ice. Tick, tick, tick. A mechanical pulse that marks the passage of time in a place where time seems completely frozen. He shifts his weight slightly. The heavy wool of his trousers rasps against the rough timber of the deck. The movement is slow, ponderous. His joints are stiff, aching with the deep, penetrating chill that manages to find its way through every layer of clothing. He reaches out a heavy, numb hand to grip the brass rail that runs along the window. The metal is astonishingly cold, biting through the thick leather of his glove. He holds onto it not for balance, but for an anchor. An anchor to reality in this surreal, floating world of darkness and ice. The ship continues its slow, rhythmic assault. Rise up, press down, grind, crack, fall forward. The cycle repeats endlessly, a monotonous, heavy waltz with the frozen ocean. The faint light from the lantern catches the brass fittings of the ship's telegraph, casting warm, circular highlights on the cold metal. The telegraph stands completely still, the brass handle locked in the position of dead slow ahead. It has not been moved in days. There is no need for speed. There is only the need for persistent, unrelenting force. The captain turns his gaze from the hypnotic, grinding ice outside to the warm, small world within the cabin. His eyes rest upon the ship's logbook lying open on the chart table. The pages are heavy, thick parchment, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting is a cramped, precise script written in dark iron gall ink. The entries are entirely devoid of emotion. They record only facts: latitude, longitude, wind direction, temperature, ice thickness, coal consumption. It is a boring history, a ledger of endurance. He takes a step toward the table. The floorboards creak, a sound that merges with the ambient groaning of the ship. He picks up the heavy fountain pen. The brass barrel is cold. He unscrews the cap with slow, deliberate twists of his thick fingers. He dips the nib into the inkwell. The ink is sluggish, thick with the cold, clinging heavily to the metal point. He brings the pen to the rough surface of the paper. The scratch of the nib is loud in the small space. It is a dry, whispering sound like the scuffing of a boot on a dusty floor. He writes the date. He writes the hour. He writes the temperature, 42 degrees below zero. The letters are formed slowly, perfectly, mechanically. There is no hurry. There is nowhere to be but exactly here, pushing against the endless ice. As he writes, the ship shudders violently. A massive, unseen ridge of ice beneath the surface resists the hull. The entire vessel vibrates, the deep, low hum of the engines dropping an octave as they strain against the unyielding barrier. The lantern swings on its brass hook, the arc of its movement casting shifting, swaying shadows across the ceiling. The amber light dances over the colored pencil textures of the wooden beams, highlighting the rough grain and the deep shadows in the corners of the room. The captain pauses his writing. He does not look up, he merely waits. He listens to the metal groaning, the wood protesting, the engines struggling. It is a familiar symphony of strain. He waits for the inevitable resolution. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure builds. The ship presses forward with the weight of thousands of tons. The sound of the grinding intensifies, becoming a deep, resonant roar that fills the cabin, vibrating in the chest. And then, a massive, deafening crack echoing up from the depths. The ship surges forward a fraction of an inch, the bow dropping slightly as the underlying ice shatters and gives way. The lantern slowly ceases its swinging. The shadows settle back into their long, stretched positions. The captain lowers the pen back to the paper. He finishes the word he was writing. He dots an I. He crosses a T. The monotonous work of recording the slow, quiet suffering of the journey continues. He sets the pen down. It rolls slightly on the tilted desk, clicking softly against the base of the lantern. He turns back to the window, back to the frosted glass and the sweeping beam of the searchlight. The snow continues to fall, dry and relentless. The wind continues to moan, a low, continuous howl that slips through the microscopic gaps in the window framing, bringing with it a fine dust of snow that settles on the interior sill. The captain exhales again. Another slow, thick cloud of white vapor joins the faint mist already hanging in the cold air. The cold is a living thing here. It sits beside him. It breathes with him. It waits with endless patience for the fire in the boiler to burn out, for the coal to turn to dust, for the ship to finally freeze completely into the white desert. But the engines thrum. The hull grinds. The ship moves forward, 1 foot, 2 feet. A slow, heavy push into the endless dark. The amber light of the lantern flickers, the shadows dance. The captain watches the ice. He feels the cold in his bones. He feels the heavy, scratchy wool against his skin. He listens to the slow, rhythmic crunch of the icebreaker crushing the Arctic Ocean. It is a boring, heavy history. A history of silence, of waiting, of the slow, methodical application of iron against ice. The night is endless. The ice is endless. The journey is endless. The cold simply is. It exists in the soft, pastel hues of the frost on the glass, in the deep, charcoal shadows of the corners of the room, in the faint, dusty light that struggles to illuminate the tiny, isolated world of the wheelhouse. The ticking of the chronometer, tick, 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 the slow intake of freezing air, the long, white exhalation, the deep, rumbling vibration of the floorboards, the sudden, sharp crack of the ice, the long, screeching grind of the hull over and over, a cycle without end. A loop of endurance and quiet, frozen suffering. The captain closes his eyes for a long, heavy moment. He listens to the ship. He listens to the wind. He lets the monotonous, heavy sounds wash over him, a lullaby of iron and ice, a symphony of the frozen world. When he opens his eyes, the view has not changed. The ice is still there. The dark is still there. The faint, warm light of the lantern is still there. He grips the cold brass rail. He stands perfectly still. He waits for the next inch. He waits for the next crack. He waits in the heavy, crushing silence of the Arctic night. The walls of the wheelhouse are paneled in dark, varnished mahogany, though the luster has long since been dulled by the constant, pervasive dampness that freezes and thaws with the shifting proximity to the ship's massive central smokestack. In the faint, flickering amber glow, These wooden surfaces look like rough, vertical strokes of burnt umber and raw sienna, hastily applied to a dark canvas. Every rivet, every brass screw head is outlined in a delicate, powdery rim of white frost. The ship is slowly freezing from the outside in. The captain's gaze drifts from the window to the ceiling, where thick wooden beams cross the narrow space. Here, the shadows are thickest, pooling like dark water. It is a study in chiaroscuro, a masterpiece of low light and deep, suffocating darkness. He feels the chill settling deeper into the marrow of his legs. The heavy sea boots he wears are lined with thick felt, yet the cold of the iron deck plate beneath the wooden floor transmits itself upward, a slow, creeping numbness. He methodically lifts his left foot, letting it fall back to the deck with a dull, heavy thud. Then the right, thud, a slow, rhythmic pacing that covers barely 3 feet of space. Thud, thud. The sound is swallowed by the larger, continuous groaning of the ship. It is an act of simple preservation, a mechanical pumping of sluggish blood through freezing veins. With every heavy step, the thick wool of his coat swishes softly. It is the sound of coarse fibers rubbing together, a dry, warm sound in an environment devoid of warmth. The air inside the cabin smells of age, of stale sweat baked into heavy fabrics, of the sharp, metallic tang of cold iron, and the pervasive, sweetish scent of the lantern oil. The oil sloshes gently within the brass reservoir of the lamp as the ship pitches fractionally. The tiny wave of fluid is visible through a small, frosted glass indicator. The captain watches it. He watches the slow, viscous movement of the yellow liquid. It is mesmerizing in its simplicity. It is the lifeblood of his small sanctuary. Outside, the wind shifts. The low moan drops in pitch, becoming a hollow, booming roar that batters the starboard side of the superstructure. The thick glass of the windows shudders in its heavy brass framing. The sound is completely isolating. It separates the captain from the rest of the crew, from the rest of the world. He is alone in this faintly lit box, suspended above the crushing reality of the ice. He turns his head slowly, the stiff collar of his coat scraping against his jawline. He looks back at the logbook. The ink has dried, leaving a matte, dark stain against the yellowish paper. The numbers stare back at him, 42 below, a number that means nothing and everything. The ship lurches again. A heavy, grinding shudder that forces the captain to lean heavily against the brass rail. The engines roar beneath his feet, a desperate, struggling sound. The iron hull screams as it scrapes along a particularly dense ridge of ancient, multi-year ice. The sound is a physical assault, a high-pitched shrieking of metal on frozen water that vibrates through the teeth and aches in the jaw. But there is no panic. There is no urgency. This is simply the work. This is the boring, monotonous history of moving through the unmoving. The screaming of the metal slowly subsides back into the low, rhythmic grind. The ship has conquered another foot of distance. The amber light continues to flicker. The deep blue and gray tones of the night press against the glass. The captain takes another slow, deep breath of the freezing air. The white plume of his breath curls and dances in the faint light, a soft, ephemeral ghost in a world of hard iron and unyielding ice. He returns to his silent vigil, watching the pale cone of the searchlight illuminate the endless, chaotic white. He stands, he waits, he endures. The continuous, heavy sleep of the Arctic holds them all in its freezing, dark embrace. The frost on the window pane is not a uniform sheet of white. It is a complex, slowly evolving geography of frozen moisture, built layer upon microscopic layer by the relentless exhalations of the man standing before it. It creeps inward from the heavy brass framing, a slow, crystalline invasion that seeks to consume the fragile circle of clear glass he has rubbed away with his thick leather glove. If one were to study this frost with the eye of an artist, it would appear as delicate, feathery strokes of a pale gray pastel pencil, pressed gently against a canvas of absolute black. The edges of the ice crystals are sharp, yet softened by the deep, pervasive darkness of the cabin, catching the faintest, dying echoes of the amber lantern light that struggles to reach this corner of the room. The captain watches the frost. He watches it grow with a glacial patience that mirrors the movement of the ship itself. It is a silent battle of inches, a slow encroachment of the outside world attempting to seal the inside world away forever. Every exhalation adds to this frozen landscape. He breathes in, drawing the bitterly cold air through his nostrils. It is a dry, stinging sensation, a physical reminder of the lethal environment that surrounds the heavy iron hull. He holds the breath for a long, heavy moment, letting the chill settle deep within his chest before releasing it in a slow, controlled stream. The white plume of vapor strikes the glass. It does not simply vanish. It clings to the frigid surface, instantly transitioning from a ghostly mist to a solid, microscopic layer of rime. He can hear the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of his own breath freezing against the pane. It is a dry, whispering sound like the softest scuff of charcoal on rough paper. The cycle repeats. Inhale the cold. Hold the heavy air. Exhale the mist. Freeze the glass. It is a monotonous rhythm, a biological clock ticking in tandem with the brass chronometer on the wall. He lowers his gaze from the creeping frost to the brass casing of the ship's compass, housed within the heavy wooden binnacle. The brass is cold. It is a deep, biting cold that seems to radiate its own negative energy into the surrounding air. The metal has lost all its warm, golden luster, appearing instead as a dull, muted bronze, shadowed in deep browns and heavy blacks. The glass dome covering the compass card is thick, slightly distorted by the cold, and coated in a fine layer of condensation that has long since turned to ice. Beneath the frozen dome, the compass card floats suspended in its liquid bath, a pale, glowing disk in the gloom. It does not swing wildly. It barely moves at all. It points steadily, stubbornly into the endless expanse of the Arctic night, a silent, illuminated guide through a world devoid of landmarks. The needle is a sharp, dark line, a solitary stroke of ink on a faded map. The captain rests his heavy, gloved hand on the rim of the binnacle. He does not grip it tightly. He merely lets the weight of his arm settle against the cold metal. The thick leather of his glove is stiff, resisting the bend of his knuckles. The leather is deeply creased, stained with dark patches of oil and the pervasive coal dust that permeates every inch of the vessel. The dust is a fine, inescapable powder. It settles on the polished wood. It coats the brass fittings. It works its way into the weave of the heavy wool coats. In the faint, flickering light of the lantern, the coal dust looks like a dusting of dark graphite, adding a gritty, textured layer to the shadows that pool in the corners of the room. It smells of ancient earth and deep, smoldering heat, a sharp metallic odor that sits heavy in the back of the throat, mingling with the scent of old tobacco and damp wool. Beneath his heavy sea boots, the vibration of the engines continues its endless, droning hum. It is a low-frequency rumble that bypasses the ears and registers directly within the bones. The heavy iron deck plates transmit the vibration upward, a continuous mechanical shiver that climbs through the thick felt lining of his boots, up through the stiff fabric of his trousers, and into his aching joints. The ship is a massive, resonating chamber, a hollow iron drum beating a slow, relentless rhythm against the ice. The thrum of the engines is the sound of survival, yet it is also a sound of profound exhaustion. It is the sound of thousands of tons of steel being forced, inch by agonizing inch, through a medium that refuses to yield. The vibration causes the small brass key of the chronometer to rattle softly against its wooden casing. A tiny, metallic chattering that weaves itself into the larger, groaning tapestry of the ship's complaints. The captain slowly turns his head, the thick, scratchy wool of his collar rubbing against the stubble on his jaw. The movement is deliberate, devoid of any sudden energy. He looks toward the heavy oak door that leads out to the open bridge wing. The door is an imposing slab of dark wood, reinforced with heavy iron hinges that are currently caked in a thick layer of white rime. The brass handle is a dull, frozen lump. The door is not just a barrier against the wind. It is a boundary between the faint, struggling warmth of the wheelhouse and the absolute, killing void outside. The gaps around the door frame are packed with frozen canvas and stiffened rope, an improvised seal against the drafts. Yet, the cold still finds a way. It bleeds through the solid wood, radiating a palpable aura of chill that makes the air near the door visibly hazy with suspended ice crystals. Through the narrow slit of clear glass on the window, the sweeping beam of the searchlight continues its monotonous arc. The light does not pierce the darkness. It merely stains it with a pale, diffused glow. The heavy snowfall catches the light, creating a swirling, chaotic curtain of bright, glaring dots against the deep, bruised navy of the surrounding night. The snowflakes are hard and dry, driven by a wind that has traveled unobstructed across hundreds of miles of frozen ocean. They strike the thick glass of the wheelhouse with the sound of thrown sand, a continuous, abrasive hissing that never ceases, never pauses for breath. It is a sound of pure erosion, the slow, methodical wearing down of the ship by the elements. The searchlight sweeps over a massive pressure ridge rising from the flat expanse of the pack ice. The ridge is a jagged, chaotic jumble of broken ice blocks, forced upward by the immense, invisible pressures of the shifting ocean currents. In the stark, angled light, the ice blocks cast long, distorted shadows that stretch away into the blackness like grasping, skeletal fingers. The visual effect is one of stark, unforgiving contrast. Blinding, chalky whites slammed against deep, bottomless blacks. It is a landscape devoid of color, devoid of softness. If it were a drawing, it would be executed entirely in heavy, aggressive strokes of black charcoal and stark white chalk on rough, dark gray paper. The textures are rough, the angles are sharp, and the scale is terrifyingly vast. The icebreaker meets the base of this frozen barricade. The low hum of the engines deepens into a strained, guttural roar. The ship's forward momentum slows to an imperceptible crawl. The captain feels the massive iron hull bite into the ice. The sound is a slow, agonizing shriek, a high-pitched scraping of metal against frozen seawater that reverberates through the entire structure of the vessel. The deck tilts slightly upward as the angled bow attempts to ride up onto the heavy ice slab. The pressure builds. The vibration intensifies, shaking the loose frost from the ceiling beams. The tiny ice crystals fall like a localized snowstorm within the dim cabin, drifting silently down through the amber glow of the lantern. The captain does not brace himself. He simply stands, rooted to the vibrating deck, a heavy, motionless shadow waiting for the inevitable release. The groaning of the ice reaches a crescendo. It is a sound of tearing, of breaking, of immense weight overcoming ancient resistance. And then, with a sharp, concussive crack that sounds like artillery fire in the confined space, the ice fractures. The ship drops heavily, lurching forward into the newly created fissure. The heavy iron hull crushes the broken slabs, forcing them down into the dark, freezing water below. The sound changes from a high shriek to a deep, tumbling rumble like heavy stones grinding together in a massive mill. The ship has gained perhaps 3 feet. The engines return to their steady, monotonous thrum. The bow levels out. The sweep of the searchlight continues. The wind continues to howl. The victory is microscopic. The journey remains endless. The captain exhales again. Another slow, white cloud joins the hazy atmosphere of the cabin. The amber light of the lantern flickers violently as a particularly strong gust of wind batters the side of the wheelhouse, finding a microscopic weakness in the seals and sending a sharp, invisible blade of cold air slicing across the room. The flame dances wildly, throwing frantic, stretching shadows across the dark mahogany paneling. The shadows leap and twist, animating the rough textures of the wood and the dull sheen of the brass fittings. For a brief moment, the static, deeply shadowed world of the wheelhouse is thrown into chaotic motion, a sudden spasm of light and dark that emphasizes the profound stillness of the men and the machinery. Then the wind drops slightly. The flame steadies. The shadows return to their long, heavy positions. The dark, charcoal stillness reclaims the space. He turns his back to the window, the movement slow and heavy. The thick wool of his coat drapes stiffly around his legs. He faces the back bulkhead of the wheelhouse, where the heavy brass chronometer is mounted securely to the dark wood. The face of the clock is a pale, creamy white, the numbers painted in a precise, utilitarian black script. The brass hands are thick and heavy, designed for legibility rather than elegance. The second hand moves with a loud, mechanical clack. Clack, clack, clack. It is a harsh, metallic sound that cuts through the low drone of the engines and the hissing of the snow. It measures out the long, dark hours in precise, unyielding increments. In this frozen void, time is the only thing that moves with absolute certainty. The ship may stall against the ice, the wind may shift, the temperature may plummet, but the brass hands will continue their slow, circular journey. He watches the second hand sweep across the lower half of the dial. He does not count the seconds. He simply observes the mechanical motion, finding a strange, numbing comfort in its relentless predictability. The ticking is a metronome for the slow, quiet suffering of the voyage. It sets the pace for the heavy footsteps on the deck, the slow scraping of the coal shovels deep in the boiler room, the agonizingly slow turning of the ship's wake freezing solid just yards behind the stern. Time here is not measured by sunrises or sunsets, for there are none. It is measured by the burning of coal, the turning of the clock, and the endless, repetitive grinding of the hull against the ice. The captain reaches up with a stiff, heavy arm to adjust the collar of his coat. His gloved fingers fumble clumsily against the rough wool, lacking the dexterity required for fine movements. The cold has seeped past the thick layers, past the heavy flannel shirts and the woolen undershirts, settling deeply into the muscles of his shoulders and neck. It is a dull, persistent ache, a heavy weight that pulls his posture downward. He endures it silently. There is no complaint to be made, no remedy to be sought. The cold is a fundamental condition of his existence, as omnipresent as the dark sky and the frozen sea. He finally manages to pull the heavy collar tighter around his throat, a small, futile gesture of defiance against the crushing environment. He looks back toward the chart table. The heavy logbook lies open, its yellowed pages catching the soft, dusty light of the lantern. The dark ink of his previous entry stands out starkly against the paper. The pen rests beside it, a cold, dormant instrument of record-keeping. The table itself is a solid block of oak, its surface scarred by years of use, stained with spilled ink and the omnipresent coal dust. It is a landscape of its own, a dark, textured plain that belongs perfectly in this world of deep shadows and rough surfaces. The captain steps toward it, his boots thudding heavily on the deck boards. He does not intend to write. He merely changes his position, a slow shifting of weight from one numb foot to the other. The silence of the cabin is a heavy, textured thing. It is not an absence of noise, but a specific composition of monotonous, continuous sounds. The deep hum of the engines, the abrasive hiss of the snow, the high, thin moan of the wind, the occasional sharp crack of the ice, the loud, metallic ticking of the clock. These sounds weave together into a thick, sonic blanket that wraps around the captain, isolating him further in his solitary vigil. He closes his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him. He feels the ship rise slightly, the deck tilting under his feet. He feels the vibration increase as the bow pushes against a new obstacle. He waits for the screech of metal. He waits for the breaking of the ice. He waits for the slow, heavy drop back into the freezing water. It is a cycle of endless endurance, a boring, repetitive history written in the dark, heavy tones of the Arctic night. The cold, the dark, the grinding ice. They are all that exists, a seamless loop of quiet, frozen suffering stretching endlessly out into the void. The heavy drop of the bow sends a sluggish shockwave through the timber floorboards. It is a dull, flat impact, devoid of any bounce or elasticity. The iron hull settles into the newly crushed fissure with a long, drawn-out groan of displaced weight. Beneath the fractured slabs of white, the Arctic Ocean is briefly exposed. It is not the blue of a temperate sea, nor the green of the shallows. It is a black liquid, thick and heavy, resembling cold oil more than water. In the pale, sweeping arc of the searchlight, this black water sloshes sluggishly against the sides of the ship, instantly beginning the process of freezing once more. Thin, crystalline needles of fresh ice dart across the surface of the black pools, weaving a frantic, silent web that seeks to stitch the wound in the ocean back together. The ship pushes forward, and the black water is left behind in the churning wake, already solidifying, already erasing the brief, violent history of the ship's passage. The captain opens his eyes. The darkness of the cabin has not changed. The faint, dusty amber light has not changed. His gaze travels slowly from the brass chronometer to the center of the room, coming to rest upon the ship's wheel. It is a massive construct, a testament to the sheer physical force required to steer thousands of tons of iron through a frozen wasteland. The wheel is fashioned from thick, dark mahogany, its grain rendered invisible by decades of accumulated grime, sweat, and the ever-present coal dust. In the dim light, the wood appears as deep, uninterrupted strokes of charcoal, solid and immovable. A ring of heavy, dull brass encircles the spokes, tarnished to the color of old earth. The brass is cold. It absorbs the meager warmth of the room and offers nothing in return. It sits perfectly still, a massive, silent circle in the center of the shadowed wheelhouse. Behind the wheel stands the helmsman. He is a silent, imposing shadow, a man reduced to a mere silhouette against the frosted glass of the aft windows. He does not speak. He does not shift his weight unnecessarily. He is an extension of the machinery, a biological component of the heavy steering gear. He wears a heavy woolen watch coat, its collar turned up so high it meets the brim of his thick, knitted cap. Only a narrow slit of his face is visible, obscured by a thick, frost-laden beard that catches the faint lantern light, turning the ice crystals into tiny, dull embers. He grips the mahogany spokes with massive, leather-clad hands. The leather is stiff, frozen into a permanent curve that matches the circumference of the wheel. He stares straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the pale, floating compass card in the binnacle. He is waiting for a command that will not come for hours. He is waiting for the ice to dictate the next fractional adjustment of the rudder. When the ice eventually forces the bow slightly to port, the helmsman responds. The movement is so slow it is almost imperceptible. He leans his considerable weight against the right side of the wheel. His heavy boots plant firmly on the wooden grate beneath him. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive wheel begins to turn. It protests with a deep, wooden creak that seems to originate from the very soul of the timber. As the wheel rotates, the heavy iron steering chains, rooted through a complex system of pulleys beneath the deck, begin to move. The sound of the chains is a heavy metallic clanking, a rhythmic dragging noise that travels up through the floorboards and vibrates in the soles of the boots. Clank, drag, clank, drag. It is the sound of immense friction, of raw physical effort pitted against the crushing resistance of the sea. The rudder, buried deep beneath the ice at the stern of the ship, shifts a fraction of a degree. The ship corrects its course. The helmsman locks his arms. The wheel becomes stationary once more. The shadow returns to absolute stillness. The temperature inside the wheelhouse continues its slow, inexorable decline. The meager heat generated by the lantern and the bodies of the two men is steadily being consumed by the vast, freezing void outside the glass. The air takes on a thick, granular quality. It feels heavy in the lungs, a dense, frigid mass that requires conscious effort to inhale. When the captain breathes, the cold air scrapes against the back of his throat, a dry, abrasive sensation that tastes of rust and old frost. The moisture from their exhalations does not merely fog the windows, it crystallizes in the air itself. Faint, glittering motes of diamond dust drift lazily through the amber beam of the lantern, catching the light for a fleeting fraction of a second before descending to coat the floorboards and the brass fittings in a microscopic layer of white. The entire room is slowly being dusted with powdered snow, a silent, indoor blizzard born from their very breath. Beneath the wooden paneling of the walls, a network of copper steam pipes runs from the distant boiler room up to the bridge. They are designed to provide warmth, to keep the instruments from freezing solid, to keep the men alive. But the distance is too great, and the cold is too profound. By the time the steam reaches the wheelhouse, it has lost much of its heat, condensing back into lukewarm water that gurgles sluggishly through the pipes. The pipes announce their presence with a slow, irregular knocking. Knock. A pause of heavy, silent seconds. Knock. It is a hollow, metallic tapping, like a trapped entity trying to signal its existence from behind the dark mahogany boards. The captain listens to the knocking. It is another instrument in the monotonous orchestra of the voyage. The deep hum of the engines, the abrasive hiss of the wind, the heavy ticking of the chronometer, the sharp crack of the ice, the slow clank of the steering chains, and the hollow knock of the steam pipes. They blend into a hypnotic, droning composition that numbs the mind and slows the pulse. To look out the forward windows is to gaze upon a canvas rendered entirely in shades of desolate gray and deepest blue. The visual language of this world is one of soft pastels applied with heavy pressure upon a dark, textured surface. There are no sharp lines outside, only blurred transitions between the massive, rolling hummocks of ice and the swirling, chaotic curtain of falling snow. The sweeping beam of the searchlight acts as a giant, pale eraser, sweeping back and forth, attempting to rub away the darkness, only to reveal the impenetrable, chalky white of the frozen ocean. The shadows cast by the ice ridges stretch away from the light, tapering into long, smoky streaks of pure black that seem to absorb the illumination entirely. It is a world without end, without variation, a continuous loop of frozen, desolate geometry that repeats itself mile after agonizing mile. There is no horizon to gaze upon, only the suffocating proximity of the storm and the ice. The captain remains by the chart table. He shifts his weight again, a slow, deliberate transfer from his left leg to his right. The thick wool of his trousers rasps against the rough timber. He reaches up and touches his face. His leather glove rubs against the thick, frost-stiffened hairs of his beard. He cannot feel the skin beneath. The cold has penetrated the heavy layers, seeping into the flesh, replacing warmth with a dull, heavy numbness. His cheeks feel like cold, unyielding wax. He slowly lowers his hand, letting it rest heavily upon the edge of the oak table. He looks down at his hand. In the faint amber light, the stained, creased leather looks like the hide of some ancient, frozen creature. He stares at it for a long time, watching the slow, microscopic accumulation of ice crystals forming on the coarse threads of the stitching. He does not flex his fingers. He simply lets the hand rest, a heavy, lifeless object anchoring him to the table. Beneath the thick iron floorboards, beneath the heavy steel bulkheads, beneath the throbbing, coal-fired heart of the ship, lies the abyss. The icebreaker does not float upon the surface. It rests upon a frozen lid that seals away thousands of fathoms of crushing black water. The captain feels the presence of that unimaginable depth. It is a heavy, silent pressure pulling downward, an invisible force that seeks to drag the heavy iron vessel into the permanent, lightless cold. The ice is merely the surface tension of a much greater, much darker void. When the hull grinds against the pack ice, the sound reverberates downward, a muffled, booming echo that travels into the deep. It is a tiny, insignificant disturbance in a realm of absolute, eternal silence. The ship is a fragile metal splinter, crawling blindly across the ceiling of a sunken world. The lantern oil sloshes gently as the bow rises once more. The tiny, yellow flame wavers, casting long, erratic shadows across the ceiling beams. The shadows stretch and contract, a slow, rhythmic breathing of darkness that mirrors the slow, rhythmic breathing of the men. The smell of the burning oil is thick and sweet, a cloying scent that mixes with the sharp tang of ozone and the stale, damp smell of heavy wool. The air is entirely stagnant. There is no circulation, only the slow, creeping advance of the cold and the slow, heavy settling of the frost. The wheelhouse is a sealed tomb, a wooden box suspended in the freezing night, moving forward at a pace so slow it mimics death. The captain breathes out, a long, slow sigh of white vapor that rolls heavily against the encroaching frost, adding another microscopic layer to the frozen barricade. The ship falls heavily. The ice cracks with a concussive boom, and the long, slow grind into the blackness begins again. The reverberation of the dropping hull slowly decays into the ambient vibration of the engines, a localized earthquake fading back into a steady, mechanical tremor. The thick oak floorboards beneath the captain's heavy sea boots absorb the final, shuddering shockwaves of the impact. The sound of the iron settling into the newly broken fissure is a long, drawn-out exhalation of stressed metal, a deep, groaning sigh that travels from the lowest compartments of the ship up through the iron bulkheads and into the frozen air of the wheelhouse. The captain does not adjust his stance. His boots remain planted exactly where they were, rooted to the deck like old, dead stumps in a frozen forest. The cold radiating from the iron plates beneath the wood continues its slow, upward migration. It is a creeping tide of numbness, moving from the soles of his feet, past his ankles, and into the heavy muscles of his calves. He feels the cold not as a sharp pain, but as a heavy, deadening weight, a slow erasure of sensation that leaves behind only the dull, persistent ache of endurance. The vibration of the engines is the only thing that assures him his legs are still connected to the trembling deck. To his right, bathed in the weakest, most exhausted fringes of the amber lantern light, stands the engine order telegraph. It is a stout, cylindrical pedestal of heavy brass, bolted firmly to the deck. In the dim, dusty light, it resembles a forgotten monument, a pillar of tarnished bronze rendered in thick, soft strokes of dark brown and heavy ochre pastel against the black canvas of the room. The brass is entirely devoid of warmth. It has surrendered its golden sheen to the pervasive, freezing dampness, taking on a dull, bruised patina that speaks of decades spent in harsh, salt-laden air. The circular face of the telegraph is covered by a thick pane of glass, which is now completely obscured by a dense, opaque layer of white frost. The frost is thickest at the edges, where it meets the heavy brass bezel, forming a raised, crystalline ridge that looks like a miniature, circular mountain range. The heavy brass handle, terminating in a worn, wooden grip, is locked firmly in the forward position. It points to an order that is no longer visible beneath the ice, but an order that has not changed in days. Dead slow ahead. The handle casts a long, sharp shadow across the frost-covered dial, a dark, perfectly straight line that intersects the chaotic, feathery patterns of the ice crystals. The air surrounding the telegraph is thick with the invisible, suspended particles of coal dust. This dust is a permanent resident of the ship, a fine, gritty powder that escapes the distant boiler rooms and finds its way into every sealed compartment, every locked drawer, every folded piece of canvas. In the wheelhouse, it mixes with the moisture of the men's breath and the fine, powdery snow that sifts through the microscopic gaps in the window frames. It settles onto the frost, creating a dirty, grayish rime that dulls the stark whiteness of the ice. When the lantern flickers, catching the dust motes as they drift lazily through the air, they appear as a slow-moving, dark constellation against the deep blue and slate gray of the surrounding shadows. The captain inhales this dust with every slow, measured breath. It coats the back of his throat, leaving a faint, metallic taste that mixes with the stale flavor of his own dry mouth. It is the taste of the ship itself, the taste of burning coal and cold iron, a flavor that has become as familiar to him as the crushing silence of the Arctic night. Beyond the frosted glass of the forward windows, the wind continues its flat, monotonous howling. It is not a variable wind. It does not gust or die away. It is a constant, unrelenting pressure, a river of moving air that flows over the frozen ocean and batters against the flat, unyielding surfaces of the superstructure. The sound of it is a high-pitched, hollow moan, a vibration that resonates within the thick glass panes and hums in the brass framing. It is the sound of absolute desolation, an auditory representation of the endless, featureless void that surrounds the ship. Carried upon this wind are millions of tiny, hardened pellets of ice. They are not delicate snowflakes. They are frozen projectiles, scoured from the surface of the pack ice and driven horizontally through the dark. They strike the wheelhouse windows with a continuous, abrasive hissing, a sound like coarse sand being poured endlessly over a rough stone surface. The hissing never stops. It is a constant, maddening abrasion, a slow, methodical attempt by the storm to erase the ship from existence, to grind it down to dust and scatter it across the black water. Through the small, circular portal the captain has rubbed clear on the window pane, the storm presents a visual field of extreme, agonizing monotony. The pale, diffused cone of the searchlight pushes into the darkness, revealing only the chaotic, swirling curtain of the driving snow. The light does not illuminate anything. It merely makes the blindness visible. The heavy, dark tones of the sky press down upon the pale, chalky hues of the ice, creating a landscape of deep, crushing claustrophobia despite its vast, infinite scale. If this scene were captured on paper, it would be drawn entirely with the sides of heavy pastel sticks. Broad, flat strokes of deep indigo and charcoal black for the night sky, bleeding seamlessly into messy, smudged expanses of cold, dirty white for the frozen sea. There would be no sharp lines, no clear boundaries, only a blurred, suffocating gradient of dark and light, moving sluggishly beneath the heavy, unmoving shadow of the ship's bow. The shadows cast by the moving ice ridges are deep, bottomless pools of pure black, stretching and distorting as the ship inches forward, long, grasping fingers of darkness that seem to reach up from the freezing depths to pull the vessel down. The captain's eyes are heavy. The eyelids feel swollen, weighed down by the sheer, crushing fatigue of the endless watch. To blink is a conscious, deliberate effort. The thick, stiff lashes, coated in microscopic beads of frozen moisture, stick together momentarily before parting again with a faint, almost imperceptible tearing sensation. He blinks slowly, staring out into the blurred, snowy void. The repetition of the falling snow, the hissing of the ice on the glass, the deep, droning hum of the engines, it all coalesces into a heavy, hypnotic blanket that drapes over his consciousness. It is a struggle to remain awake, yet there is nothing to be awake for. There are no decisions to be made, no course corrections to order, no dangers to avoid that are not already immediately present and unavoidable. There is only the slow, grinding push forward. His duty is simply to exist within this space, to be the conscious anchor of the ship, to witness the slow, boring history of iron conquering ice, inch by agonizing inch. He stands perfectly still, a statue of thick wool and cold leather, breathing out slow, white clouds of vapor that add to the creeping frost on the glass. In the deep shadows at the rear of the wheelhouse, the helmsman remains a fixed point of absolute stillness. He is a dark, heavy mass against the faintly lighter rectangle of the aft window. He has not moved since the last fractional turn of the great mahogany wheel. His hands, encased in their stiff, frozen leather gloves, remain locked onto the heavy spokes. His gaze remains fixed upon the dull, glowing card of the compass in the binnacle. He is breathing, but the movement of his chest beneath the thick layers of his watch coat is imperceptible. Only the rhythmic appearance of his white breath, pluming out from beneath the frost-caked rim of his collar, proves that he is alive. The breath rises slowly into the freezing air, drifting up toward the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, where it condenses and freezes, adding to the microscopic layer of rime that coats the upper half of the cabin. The helmsman is an extension of the mahogany wheel, a silent biological gear in the vast, slow machinery of the ship. He does not speak. He does not complain. He simply waits in the dark, his hands gripping the cold wood, his eyes watching the slow, floating needle that points endlessly into the black void. The only sound that cuts through the continuous, heavy drone of the ship and the storm is the sharp, metallic ticking of the chronometer. Tick, tick, tick. It is a harsh, unforgiving sound, a mechanical pulse that measures out the suffering in precise, equal increments. The brass hands of the clock move with a jerky, exact motion, sweeping across the pale, creamy dial. The face of the clock is slightly illuminated by the stray beams of the lantern, throwing the black, utilitarian numbers into sharp relief against the pale background. In the vast, featureless expanse of the Arctic night, where days and nights bleed into one continuous dark loop, the clock is the only objective measure of reality. It dictates the changing of the watches, the shoveling of the coal, the agonizingly slow progress of the ship across the frozen map. Yet, staring at the clock offers no comfort. It only serves to emphasize the incredible slowness of the passage, the vast, yawning stretches of time that must be endured between each microscopic victory over the ice. The captain listens to the ticking. He lets it merge with the thrum of the engines and the hiss of the snow. Tick, grind, hiss, tick, grind, hiss. A heavy, monotonous rhythm that numbs the mind and freezes the soul. Slowly, the pitch of the engines begins to change. The deep, resonant hum drops lower, becoming a guttural, strained roar that vibrates violently in the floorboards. The ship has encountered a new obstacle, a thicker, older slab of multi-year ice that refuses to yield to the slow pressure of the hull. The forward momentum of the vessel ceases entirely. The ship sits suspended in the dark, pushing uselessly against the immovable barrier. The captain feels the change in the vibration. It travels up through his numb legs, up through his spine, rattling the deep, cold ache in his shoulders. He does not move. He does not reach for the telegraph. There is no other order to give. The engines must simply push until the ice breaks, or until the coal runs out. The sound of the straining machinery fills the small, sealed cabin, a deafening, mechanical scream that drowns out the howling of the wind and the ticking of the clock. The lantern flickers wildly, the amber light dancing across the frosted glass and the dark mahogany walls, throwing chaotic, leaping shadows that emphasize the immense, invisible pressure building beneath the bow. The iron hull groans. It is a sound of immense, structural agony, a deep, twisting creak that seems to originate from the very rivets that hold the ship together. The massive weight of the vessel presses forward, forcing the angled bow upward against the edge of the ice slab. The deck tilts slightly, a slow, agonizing incline that forces the captain to shift his weight heavily onto his back foot. The thick wool of his coat swishes softly as he adjusts his stance. The screaming of the metal intensifies, a high-pitched, tearing sound that sets the teeth on edge and vibrates in the hollows of the skull. The ice complains in return, a series of sharp, concussive cracks that sound like rifle fire snapping across the frozen void. The pressure is absolute. It is a contest of raw, unyielding physics. Thousands of tons of iron driven by burning coal, pitted against millions of tons of frozen seawater. The captain waits. He watches the pale cone of the searchlight illuminating the chaotic, churning snow. He breathes in the cold, dusty air. He exhales a slow, white cloud. The ship groans. The engines roar. The ice cracks. The heavy, boring history of the long, dark night continues. The slow, relentless crushing of the Arctic Ocean goes on, without pause, without mercy, without end. The suspension of the bow upon the massive slab of multi-year ice is a moment drawn out into an agonizing, breathless eternity. The heavy iron deck remains tilted at a slight, unnatural angle, forcing the captain to maintain his backward-leaning stance just to remain upright. The thick, felt-lined soles of his sea boots press firmly against the rough, freezing timber of the floorboards, resisting the gentle, persistent pull of gravity that seeks to slide him toward the aft bulkhead. Above his head, the brass storm lantern hangs perfectly plumb, suspended from its heavy iron hook, but the ceiling itself is angled against it, creating a visual dissonance that adds to the surreal, dreamlike quality of the static wheelhouse. The flame within the soot-stained glass chimney burns steadily, casting its weak, dusty amber glow against the tilted mahogany panels. The shadows, rendered in deep, velvety charcoal and bruised navy, stretch in elongated, distorted shapes, clinging to the corners of the room like heavy, dark water pooling in the low spots of a sinking vessel. The entire ship shudders continuously, a violent, high-frequency vibration born from the desperate, maximum output of the steam engines buried deep within the frozen iron belly. It is a mechanical trembling that shakes the marrow in the bones, a relentless, teeth-rattling thrum that makes the heavy, stiff wool of the captain's coat vibrate almost imperceptibly against his numb skin. The sound is a deafening, monotonous roar, a flat, unchanging note of extreme mechanical suffering, as thousands of tons of steel attempt to overcome the sheer, unyielding mass of the frozen ocean. Beneath this deafening roar, the specific, localized sounds of the iron hull scraping against the ice are magnified into a cacophony of slow, agonizing destruction. It is not a clean, slicing sound. It is a blunt, brutal grinding, an endless, high-pitched shriek of metal being forcibly dragged across a surface harder than rock. The friction generates absolutely no heat in this lethal environment. It only produces noise and a fine, powdery spray of pulverized ice that drifts down into the black water trapped below. If one were to translate this auditory experience into a visual medium, it would be a series of harsh, jagged strokes of white and silver pastel, violently slashed across a canvas of absolute black, aggressive and devoid of any softening nuance. The ship acts as a massive, blunt wedge, relying entirely on gravity, burning coal, and relentless forward momentum. The iron plates of the bow, inches thick and reinforced by massive internal steel ribs, bear the entire brunt of the ocean's silent resistance. The captain feels the strain in his own chest, a sympathetic, tight knot of muscles as he waits for the inevitable resolution of physics. He watches the pale, diffused cone of the searchlight illuminating the swirling, chaotic blizzard beyond the frosted glass, the beam shifting slightly upward due to the angle of the deck, painting the falling snow in ghostly, transient flashes of chalky white against the encroaching, suffocating dark. The breaking of the ice does not happen all at once. It begins as a deep, structural groan, a subterranean reverberation that originates far beneath the surface of the frozen crust. It is a sound that bypasses the ears and registers directly in the soles of the heavy boots, a low, booming frequency that signals the failure of ancient, frozen bonds. The captain feels the initial shudder of the fracture before he truly hears it. The continuous, high-pitched shrieking of the hull suddenly deepens into a series of massive, concussive snaps. Crack. The sound is exactly like the firing of heavy artillery in a sealed, subterranean cavern, a flat, echoing report that momentarily drowns out the howling of the wind and the roaring of the engines. Crack. Another fissure opens, a jagged, dark line appearing in the stark white landscape, illuminated by the searchlight, spreading outward like a vein of black ink on wet paper. The ice is finally surrendering, tearing itself apart under the unimaginable, localized pressure of the hull. And then, the resistance simply vanishes. The massive, multi-year slab shatters into thousands of heavy, irregular blocks. The bow of the icebreaker, suddenly unsupported by the white shelf, drops back down toward the surface of the sea with a terrifying, ponderous gravity. The impact of the heavy iron hull striking the newly exposed water and the crushed ice is a dull, flat thud that sends a violent shockwave through the entire superstructure. The deck drops violently beneath the captain's feet, forcing him to bend his stiff, aching knees to absorb the heavy shock. The lantern swings wildly on its brass hook, its arc erratic and panicked, throwing leaping, chaotic shadows across the dark wooden beams of the ceiling. For a brief, dizzying moment, The steady, monotonous world of the wheelhouse is thrown into jarring disarray. The heavy logbook on the chart table slides an inch to the left, the dry scratching of its heavy paper against the oak swallowed by the boom of the hull. A small shower of accumulated frost shakes loose from the window frames, falling like a localized, indoor snowstorm within the dim cabin, the tiny crystals catching the amber light as they drift downward. Outside, the massive weight of the ship displaces tons of black, freezing water. The water surges up through the cracks in the broken ice, thick and sluggish, resembling cold, heavy oil rather than seawater. It washes over the shattered white blocks, instantly beginning the process of freezing them back together in a new, chaotic configuration. The broken slabs of ice, some as large as small houses, scrape along the iron sides of the ship as it pushes forward into the newly created breach. A continuous, heavy tumbling sound that replaces the high-pitched shriek of the initial assault. As the ship levels out, the heavy tilt of the deck vanishing, the engines find their steady rhythm once more. The desperate, strained roar of maximum output subsides back into the familiar, deep, droning hum. The violent, high-frequency vibration fades into the steady, mechanical tremor that is the constant, numbing companion of the voyage. The lantern gradually ceases its wild swinging, its arc becoming smaller and smaller until it returns to a perfectly plumb, motionless hang. The shadows reassert themselves against the bulkheads, settling back into their long, stretched positions, returning to their deep, charcoal stillness. The captain slowly straightens his legs, feeling the dull, persistent ache in his joints protest the simple movement. The thick wool of his coat settles heavily back around his shoulders, a stiff, freezing armor. He reaches up a numb, gloved hand to brush the fallen frost from the collar of his coat. The ice crystals are dry and hard, completely devoid of moisture, feeling like tiny grains of coarse white sand against the stiff leather. He brushes them away with a slow, deliberate motion, the heavy leather of his glove rasping loudly against the coarse fabric. The brief moment of violent action has passed, swallowed whole by the vast, unending silence of the Arctic night. The boring history of the journey resumes, a slow, methodical advance through the absolute darkness. He turns his gaze slowly toward the back bulkhead, seeking the pale, illuminated dial of the heavy brass chronometer. The clock has not been disturbed by the heavy impact. Its heavy brass hands continue their precise, unyielding sweep across the creamy white face. Tick, tick, tick. The harsh, metallic sound cuts through the returning drone of the engines, a mechanical pulse that measures the void of the night. The passing of time in this place is a heavy, physical burden. Each tick represents another fraction of an inch gained, another ounce of black coal burned in the furnaces below, another moment of freezing endurance required from the men. The captain watches the second hand complete its slow, stuttering circle. A minute has passed. A minute of darkness. A minute of grinding ice. A minute of quiet, absolute suffering. It is a cycle that repeats endlessly, a closed loop of cold and iron from which there is no escape. He looks away from the clock, the numbers blurring into a meaningless pattern of black ink on a pale background. The concept of hours and days has lost its meaning entirely. There is only the watch, the ice, and the deep, persistent cold that seeps into every corner of his being. He steps back to the forward window, to the small, circular portal he has kept clear of the creeping frost. The glass is astonishingly cold, radiating a negative thermal energy that chills the air inches away from its surface. The frost surrounding his viewing portal has grown during the short time he was distracted by the breaking of the ice. The delicate, feathery patterns of ice crystals have crept further inward, their edges sharp and defined in the faint, dusty amber light. The frost looks like a heavy application of white chalk on a dark gray slate, the strokes layered one upon another to create a dense, opaque barrier of freezing geometry. It is a beautiful, terrifying sight, a slow, silent invasion that seeks to completely blind the ship to the outside world. He raises his heavy, leather-clad hand and presses his numb thumb against the glass once more. The leather squeaks, a dry, protesting sound, as he rubs away the newly formed crystals. The friction creates absolutely no heat, only a slight smearing of the ice, clearing the view just enough to see the endless, swirling snow outside. The hissing of the ice pellets against the glass continues, an unbroken stream of abrasive sound that wears away at the nerves like coarse sandpaper on soft, old wood. He inhales deeply. The air inside the wheelhouse is so cold it feels thick, a dense, granular fluid that actively resists being drawn into the lungs. It burns a cold path down his throat, expanding in his chest with a heavy, aching pressure that demands endurance. He holds the breath, letting the meager, failing warmth of his core interact with the freezing air, a silent, internal battle that he fights with every single respiration. Slowly, he exhales. The breath escapes his parted lips in a thick, rolling cloud of white vapor. In the faint, dusty light of the lantern, the vapor looks like a ghost, a transient, ethereal shape that twists and turns before dissolving into the darker, colder shadows of the cabin. The moisture from his breath settles onto the brass framing of the window, onto the thick wool of his coat, onto his own stiff eyelashes, adding to the microscopic layer of rime that coats everything in the wheelhouse. He is slowly, literally freezing into his environment, becoming a permanent part of the static, heavily textured landscape of the ship. The cold is a living, breathing entity, sitting heavily upon his shoulders, pressing against his chest, wrapping its invisible, numb fingers around his wrists and ankles. At the absolute rear of the wheelhouse, swallowed by the deepest shadows, the silent silhouette of the helmsman shifts slightly. The heavy drop of the bow and the subsequent chaotic plowing through the broken ice blocks have altered the ship's heading by a tiny fraction of a degree. The helmsman, a dark mass rendered entirely in strokes of deepest indigo and black pastel, responds with the agonizing slowness that defines every action on this heavy vessel. He leans his considerable weight against the left side of the massive mahogany wheel. The thick, frozen leather of his gloves grips the dark, polished wood. He pushes. The wheel groans, a deep, resonant creak of ancient, stressed timber protesting the movement. The heavy iron steering chains rooted beneath the floorboards begin to clank, a slow, dragging rhythm that vibrates up through the soles of the captain's boots. Clank, drag, clank, drag. The rudder, far beneath the freezing surface of the black water, pushes against the heavy sea. The compass card in the binnacle, floating in its cold, sluggish liquid bath, slowly rotates back to its proper, unyielding alignment. The needle settles, a sharp, dark line pointing steadily back into the absolute void. The helmsman locks his arms once more. The wheel ceases its turning. The heavy chains fall completely silent. The shadow returns to absolute, unmoving stillness. The microscopic correction is complete. The ship continues its straight, unyielding path into the dark. The heavy, monotonous rhythm of the icebreaker reestablishes itself completely. The deep, continuous, bone-rattling thrum of the engines. The abrasive, endless hissing of the snow on the glass. The occasional, hollow, metallic knocking of the sluggish steam in the distant copper pipes. The sharp, mechanical, unforgiving ticking of the brass chronometer. These sounds weave together to form a thick, isolating blanket of noise that wraps around the captain, completely sealing him away from the rest of the world, from memory, from hope. He stands perfectly still by the frosted window, a figure carved from thick wool and cold leather, illuminated only by the faint, dying rays of the amber lantern. He watches the pale cone of the searchlight sweep across the broken, chaotic terrain of the newly conquered ice. The shadows stretch and distort deep, black pools of darkness that seem to swallow the pale light entirely. The cold deepens its grip on his bones. The darkness presses inward against the glass. The boring, silent history of the long night stretches out before him, an endless expanse of quiet suffering and frozen endurance. He waits for the next ridge of ice to rise from the dark. He waits for the next concussive crack to shake the floorboards. He waits in the absolute, crushing, eternal stillness of the deep Arctic cold. The thick, heavy iron rivets that hold the massive timber ceiling of the wheelhouse together are not merely structural fasteners designed to bind wood to iron. They are direct, unforgiving conduits for the absolute zero of the outside world. They pull the killing cold down through the heavy exterior layers of the roof, bypassing whatever meager insulation exists, functioning as localized, unrelenting epicenters of freezing air. Around the head of each massive iron dome, a thick, raised collar of white rime has formed, slowly building upon itself layer by microscopic layer. In the dim, dusty glow of the suspended storm lantern, these concentric rings of frost look like deliberate, careful applications of a soft, pale blue chalk against the dark, varnished mahogany. The wood itself, stained completely dark by decades of coal smoke, deep dampness, and the slow passage of time, serves as the rough, heavily textured canvas for this continuous, slow-motion drawing. The frost does not stop at the iron rivets. It creeps outward along the natural, ancient grain of the timber, tracing the microscopic valleys and ridges in the wood with a delicate, feathery, and terrifying precision. To stare at the ceiling is to watch a massive map of the cold slowly drawing itself in real time, a detailed cartography of creeping numbness, rendered entirely in shades of slate gray, bruised navy, and dirty, chalky white. Beyond the thick, salt-stained panes of the forward windows, the invisible, heavy architecture of the wind constructs and deconstructs itself in a continuous moaning loop of sound. The wind here does not blow in sudden, erratic gusts. It flows exactly like a heavy, unseen river of freezing water, a constant, crushing and monotonous pressure against the flat, unyielding face of the iron superstructure. The thick glass of the windows, mounted securely in their heavy frames of tarnished, freezing brass, flexes infinitesimally under the sheer, unimaginable weight of the moving air. This microscopic bending of the glass produces a sound, a low, structural thrumming that harmonizes perfectly with the deep, rumbling vibration of the steam engines buried far below the waterline. It is a drone of absolute, unbroken desolation. Against the outside of the glass, the hardened, frozen pellets of ice continue their relentless, abrasive, and hissing assault. They strike the pane with a sound that perfectly mimics the endless pouring of coarse, gray sand onto a sheet of dull, cold iron. Hiss, scrape, hiss, scrape. It is a physical texture of sound, a rough, grating audio loop that files away at the edges of consciousness, demanding nothing but silent, unmoving endurance. The window pane is a fragile, transparent shield, separating the faint, struggling and failing warmth of the interior from a void that seeks only to consume all heat and all stillness. The captain bears the immense physical weight of this environment draped directly across his shoulders in the form of his heavy, naval-issue greatcoat. The wool is unimaginably dense, woven so tightly that it feels less like a woven fabric and more like a thick, flexible shell of dark, stiffened felt. It smells profoundly and permanently of the long, dark voyage, a deep, steeped aroma of ancient coal smoke, damp, heavy fibers that have not been truly dry in months, and the sharp, metallic tang of the frozen, oxygen-starved ocean air. The thick collar, turned up entirely to protect the vulnerable, freezing skin of his neck and jaw, is a rigid, unyielding barricade of scratchy wool. It scrapes against his thick, ice-coated stubble with a dry, harsh friction every time he moves his head by even a fraction of an inch, a sound that is incredibly loud in the small, tightly enclosed space of his own hearing. The cold has completely seeped into the outer layers of the wool, actively stealing away whatever residual failing body heat had managed to penetrate the inner flannels and linens. The coat is no longer merely an article of clothing to keep the weather out. It is a heavy, frozen carapace, a burdensome physical necessity that requires constant, dull, and draining effort simply to wear. His shoulders slope slightly downward under the sheer mass of it, a posture of permanent, quiet endurance forced upon him by the crushing weight of the polar night. He rests his heavily gloved hands upon the thick, freezing brass rail that spans the width of the window frame, seeking a solid anchor in a world that is constantly, violently vibrating. The brass is a dull, lifeless expanse of deeply cold metal, stripped entirely of all its warm, golden luster, and reduced to a dark, tarnished, and bruised bronze in the low, dusty light. The leather of his heavy gloves, thick and deeply greased against the omnipresent moisture, is entirely stiffened by the profound drop in the cabin's temperature. The deep creases in the dark leather, resembling deep ravines formed by years of gripping icy ropes and massive wooden wheels, are highlighted by microscopic, granular accumulations of pure white frost. When he shifts his grip slightly, the leather does not fold naturally or quietly. It loudly resists, popping and creaking with a dull sound exactly like ancient, dry parchment being forcibly bent. The aggressive cold from the brass rail transmits itself effortlessly through the thick leather, traveling through the inner lining of rough, scratchy wool, and sinking directly into the marrow of the bones in his fingers. It is an aching, deep-seated and permanent numbness, a slow biological retreat of warm blood from the extremities in a desperate bid to protect the vital organs. He does not pull his hands away from the freezing metal. To pull away is to acknowledge the pain, to break the stoic, motionless, and heavy vigil of the watch. He simply lets his hands rest, two heavy, dark lumps of frozen, frost-bitten leather anchoring him firmly to the vibrating, groaning structure of the icebreaker. Through the small, imperfectly circular portal he has continuously rubbed clear on the window pane, the outside world is entirely reduced to a singular, hypnotic and blinding visual field. The forward searchlight, a massive, heavy drum of riveted iron and thick, curved crystal, projects a diffused, ghostly and pale cone of illumination directly into the eternal, heavy night. The beam does not reveal a destination, nor does it illuminate a path forward. It only serves to reveal the terrifying, suffocating density of the ongoing storm. Millions upon millions of tiny, hardened snowflakes violently rush into the path of the light, existing for only a microscopic fraction of a second as blindingly bright, sharp sparks of pure, chalky white before being instantly swallowed again by the absolute, crushing, and bottomless blackness on the other side of the beam. The geometry of their chaotic flight is a swirling, frantic mess, driven horizontally by the relentless, invisible weight of the wind. In the context of a drawn, pastel image, it is a manic, frantic, and heavy scribbling of sharp white chalk over a deep, dark and heavily smudged charcoal void. The tired eyes naturally follow one individual flake, tracking its glowing trajectory, only to lose it instantly in the dense, white noise of the blizzard. The visual effect is intensely and deeply soporific, a massive, glowing pendulum swinging continuously back and forth in the darkness, pulling the heavy, exhausted mind down into a slow, lethargic state of blank, thoughtless observation. There is absolutely nothing out there to analyze, and nothing to interpret. There is only the endless, rushing, horizontal stream of sharp white against deep black. Directly behind him, resting heavily upon the dark oak surface of the chart table, the ship's logbook remains open in quiet, unmoving testament to the agonizingly slow passage of freezing time. The large pages of the thick book are heavy and stiff, infused with a faint, sickly yellowness that speaks loudly of the damp, salt-laden air that permeates every inch of the vessel. The most recent numerical entry, written in the captain's own cramped, stiff, and freezing handwriting, sits perfectly upon the pale page like a dark, permanent, and motionless scar. The iron gall ink, a deep, bruised shade of purple and heavy black, has completely dried to a flat, matte finish, reflecting absolutely none of the ambient, struggling amber light of the lantern above. In the intense, creeping cold of the wheelhouse, the remaining ink trapped inside the heavy brass reservoir of the fountain pen resting beside the book has begun to turn thick and sluggish, congealing into a cold, useless, viscous sludge. The heavy pen itself is a completely cold, dormant, and perfectly still cylinder, its dark brass exterior clouded entirely with a fine, powdery layer of condensation that has long since frozen solid into ice. The heavy table, the open book, the frozen pen, they exist together as a perfectly still life rendered heavily in deep shadows and muted, dusty tones, a quiet, forgotten corner of the wheelhouse dedicated entirely to the boring, repetitive, and endless recording of a dark journey that seems to possess absolutely no conclusion. The falling temperature, the unmoving heading, the crushing ice conditions. The raw facts are laid down mechanically in dark ink, but the true reality of the heavy, silent suffering remains entirely trapped in the freezing air, forever unwritten and forever unsaid. Deep in the absolute darkest well of shadows at the extreme rear of the cabin, the helmsman flawlessly maintains his statuesque, heavy, and completely unchanging pose. He is nothing more than a massive, dark silhouette, a heavy, unmoving shape perfectly blocking the faint, frosted, and diffused light of the aft windows. The only faint illumination that manages to reach his position is the soft, eerie, and upward-casting glow from the heavy brass binnacle housing the floating compass card. This specific light is a pale, sickly, and aquatic green, completely distinct and separated from the warm, dusty amber of the storm lantern hanging overhead. It casts a severe, upward-angled, and deeply unnatural illumination that heavily highlights the rough, frozen texture of his thick, ice-caked beard and the deep, dark, bottomless hollows pooling beneath his heavy brow. His eyes are entirely invisible, hidden perfectly within pools of absolute, undisturbed black chalk. He looks significantly less like a living, breathing man, and much more like a deeply shaded, heavily textured charcoal portrait of a forgotten naval ghost, a tragic figure permanently and silently etched into the heavy gloom of the wheelhouse walls. His massive, heavily leather-clad hands remain firmly and permanently locked upon the thick wooden spokes of the great, dark mahogany wheel. He breathes incredibly slowly, the thick white vapor curling out heavily from beneath his stiffened collar, briefly catching the pale, sickly green light of the compass before drifting slowly upward into the heavy, dark, and freezing air of the ceiling. He is the biological anchor at the very end of the iron chain, the perfectly silent operator of the massive, hidden, and deeply buried rudder. He simply waits in the freezing dark, and the crushing ice entirely dictates his next invisible movement. The fundamental, inescapable reality of existence upon the icebreaker is the continuous, heavy vibration. It is the omnipresent, physical and bone-deep sensation that strictly defines all life within the freezing iron hull. The thick, dark oak floorboards of the wheelhouse are not merely a solid surface to stand upon. They are a direct, unyielding transmitting surface for the immense, mechanical, and desperate struggle occurring continuously deep below the freezing waterline. The incredibly heavy, low-frequency hum of the massive coal-fired steam engines travels straight up the solid iron ribs of the ship, shaking the entire wooden deck with a continuous, rhythmic, and inescapable tremor. It is a deeply resonant drone that constantly rattles the cold teeth in the jaw and continuously vibrates the heavy fluid deep within the inner ear. It is the exact, unyielding sound of thousands of tons of heavy steel attempting to push against an entirely immovable, frozen object. The captain feels this continuous vibration traveling up through the thick, stiff, felt-lined soles of his massive sea boots. It is a deeply and profoundly wearying physical sensation, a heavy, continuous toll exacted upon the human body simply for the act of standing perfectly still. The sheer, unseen physical energy required to remain upright and balanced on a heavy deck that constantly shivers, grinds, and tilts is immense, slowly and methodically draining the body of its final, meager reserves of warmth, strength, and simple endurance. The vibration is the true mechanical heartbeat of the vessel, an incredibly slow, phenomenally heavy, and deeply strained palpitation that perfectly echoes the slow, heavy, and strained beating of his own freezing, exhausted heart. The gentle, erratic swinging of the brass storm lantern has finally ceased entirely. It now hangs completely motionless, suspended perfectly plumb from its heavy iron hook, resembling a small, incredibly fragile, and captive star encased forever in thick, soot-stained and freezing glass. The tiny flame burning within the glass chimney is a minuscule, perfect teardrop of pale, sickly yellow and very faint, dusty orange, burning with a perfectly steady, entirely unblinking and desperate intensity. It slowly consumes the thick, sweet-smelling and heavily freezing oil with a microscopic, unheard hiss, a tiny sound entirely and permanently lost beneath the roaring, deafening blanket of the deep engines and the screaming wind. Because the brass lantern is now perfectly and completely still, the deep shadows it casts across the room are also perfectly, heavily, and permanently still. They do absolutely not dance, and they do not leap. They simply lie incredibly heavy and perfectly flat against the dark mahogany bulkheads, functioning as solid, immovable blocks of deep, bruised indigo and pure, unadulterated black. The entire visual geometry of the small room is strictly defined by these heavy, dark shapes. The sharp, unmoving, diagonal shadow cast by the heavy engine order telegraph. The broad, dark, perfectly rectangular shadow cast entirely by the heavy oak chart table. The immense, sprawling, and bottomless pool of absolute darkness that completely surrounds and swallows the motionless helmsman. To cast a slow glance around the freezing wheelhouse is to view a perfect masterclass in utterly static composition, a heavy, dark, and deeply textured drawing, where the negative space of the deep shadows holds exactly as much physical weight, presence, and texture as the faintly illuminated surfaces of the wood and brass. It is a tiny, isolated world suspended perfectly in an incredibly heavy, dark, and freezing amber, entirely motionless, entirely silent beneath the noise, and eternally, profoundly cold. The heavy icebreaker continues to push forward into the void, a tiny fraction of a single inch. Then, another tiny fraction. The immense, angled, solid iron bow grinds relentlessly against the frozen, unyielding surface of the Black Sea, a slow, agonizing, and incredibly heavy friction that creates a low, continuous, and groaning structural complaint deep within the ancient iron bones of the heavy ship. There is absolutely no triumphant, shattering crash, and there is no sudden, glorious breaking of the heavy pack ice. There is only the persistent, boring, and relentless physical application of immense mass against infinite resistance. The defining sound is a continuous, incredibly dull, and heavy scrape, a massive, dragging and screeching noise that blends perfectly and seamlessly with the heavy hum of the deep engines and the relentless hiss of the dark storm outside. The captain remains standing perfectly still at the freezing window. He does absolutely not shift his heavy weight. He does not turn his stiff, freezing head. He simply watches the endless, rushing stream of white flakes fly into the pale, weak light and vanish instantly into the crushing dark. The heavy brass chronometer bolted to the back wall continues to tick loudly in the gloom. Tick, tick, tick. The cold, mechanical seconds fall away endlessly into the frozen, dark void, entirely uncounted, entirely unnoticed, and completely unmourned. The incredibly long, phenomenally heavy, and crushing polar night stretches out boundlessly in all possible directions, an infinite, unyielding expanse of deep ice and screaming wind. The heavy, boring, and silent history of the desperate journey quietly adds yet another perfectly silent, completely unwritten, and entirely forgotten page to its endless, freezing ledger. The quiet, heavy, and completely unmoving suffering of the deep cold simply continues, an incredibly slow, phenomenally deep, and entirely mechanical freezing of the heavy world that knows absolutely no end, absolutely no pause, and absolutely no mercy whatsoever. The network of heavy, tarnished copper pipes that runs vertically through the internal bulkheads of the ship is a failed circulatory system of a dying mechanical beast. These pipes were originally designed to carry high-pressure, superheated steam from the massive, roaring coal furnaces deep within the lowest levels of the iron hull, directly up to the exposed, vulnerable compartments like the wheelhouse. However, the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of the Arctic cold effectively neutralizes this engineering effort long before the steam can reach its final destination. As the vapor rises through the dark, freezing iron arteries of the vessel, it is relentlessly sapped of its thermal energy. By the time it arrives at the thick, riveted mahogany walls of the bridge, it is no longer a violently hot, invisible gas, but a sluggish, lukewarm, and heavily defeated stream of condensed water. This water moves erratically through the dark, hidden pipes, announcing its pathetic, failing presence with a series of hollow, metallic knocks. Knock. A long, drawn-out pause of several heavy minutes. Knock. It is a deeply mournful sound, a completely futile mechanical tapping that merely highlights the overwhelming, crushing victory of the absolute zero outside over the burning coal below. In the context of a drawn, textured image, these hidden pipes would be rendered as faint, dying streaks of pale orange pastel buried deep beneath layers of heavy, dark, and completely unyielding charcoal gray. A warmth that is fundamentally trapped and entirely suffocated by the surrounding dark mass. The captain listens to this irregular, hollow knocking without turning his head. It is simply another rhythmic component of the incredibly boring, deeply monotonous sonic landscape that continuously envelops him. The sound of the failing steam perfectly matches the heavy, creeping numbness that is slowly migrating up from his heavy sea boots into the thick, stiffened muscles of his calves. He stands perfectly, rigidly still, allowing the heavy, bone-rattling vibration of the floorboards to travel completely unobstructed through his skeletal frame. To shift his weight, to actively flex his knees or roll his deeply aching shoulders would require a massive expenditure of physical energy that he simply cannot afford to waste. The heavy, dark wool of his naval greatcoat hangs perfectly motionless around his frame, functioning less as a garment and more as a thick, rigid, and freezing architectural structure built completely around his standing body. The deep, heavy folds of the thick fabric are entirely solid, locked firmly into place by the pervasive dampness that has frozen into the very fibers of the wool. If he were to strike the fabric with his heavy leather glove, it would not yield or crumple. It would produce a dull, flat thud, exactly like a heavy piece of frozen, bark-covered wood being struck in the absolute dead of winter. The coat is a dark, heavily shaded monument to endurance, rendered entirely in strokes of deep indigo and bruised navy against the failing amber light. Directly in front of him, the microscopic, feathery invasion of the frost upon the thick window pane continues its incredibly slow, entirely relentless advance. The small, imperfectly circular viewing portal that he had previously cleared with the stiff thumb of his leather glove is actively being reclaimed by the deep cold. The intricate, sharply geometric crystals of white rime creep inward from the heavy brass edges, slowly shrinking the diameter of the clear glass. They grow organically, yet with a terrifying mathematical precision, layering perfectly over one another in a dense, opaque lattice of frozen moisture. The captain watches this slow encroachment with a heavy, completely detached, and utterly exhausted fascination. He observes the microscopic creation of this frozen architecture exactly as one might watch the incredibly slow drying of thick, dark oil paint on a canvas. The frost is entirely devoid of color. It is a study in absolute starkness, existing only in variations of pure, blinding white, dirty, coal-stained gray, and the deep, underlying blackness of the night sky that it steadily works to obscure. The sharp, abrasive hissing of the external snow against the glass provides a continuous, grating soundtrack to this slow, visual erasure. It is the sound of the world being completely ground down to a fine, freezing powder. He realizes that he must clear the glass again, yet the fundamental command to move his arm simply dies somewhere between his deeply exhausted mind and the freezing muscles of his heavy shoulder. The sheer inertia of his own body is immense, a crushing, physical weight that anchors him permanently to the vibrating deck. He breathes in slowly, drawing the thick, icy air over his dry, cracked tongue. The air tastes strongly of ancient metallic rust, stale woolen fibers, and the incredibly sharp, ozone-heavy scent of the endless polar storm. He holds the freezing air deep within his lungs, feeling the painful, aching chill radiate outward through his chest cavity. When he finally exhales, the thick, white plume of vapor escapes his parted lips with agonizing slowness. It hits the encroaching ring of frost on the window pane, and instead of melting the delicate crystals, the moisture in his breath instantly and permanently adheres to them, rapidly accelerating their inward growth. His own biological processes are actively contributing to the slow, visual sealing of the wheelhouse. He is literally breathing the walls of his own frozen prison into existence, one slow, heavy exhalation at a time. The heavy, dark irony of this physical reality is completely lost in the monotonous, mind-numbing drone of the ship's deep, groaning machinery. Behind him, in the absolute deepest, blackest well of shadows, the heavy brass chronometer abruptly clicks over to a new minute. The sound is sharp, completely metallic, and incredibly loud in the heavy, textured silence between the groans of the hull. Clack. It is a deeply unforgiving sound, a stark, mechanical reminder that time continues to move forward even when the ship itself is completely, hopelessly stalled against the massive pack ice. The heavy, black hands of the clock, painted meticulously against the pale, creamy, and heavily frosted dial, do absolutely not care about the crushing cold or the endless dark. They simply turn, precise and entirely unfeeling, mechanically measuring the slow, boring history of the long night in perfectly equal, completely identical segments of quiet suffering. The captain does absolutely not turn around to look at the clock. The specific, exact numerical value of the hour is entirely and completely meaningless. It could be 3 in the morning, or it could be 11 at night. The absolute, bottomless darkness outside the frosted glass remains perfectly and identically unchanged. The only true measure of time in this freezing void is the slow, agonizing consumption of the heavy black coal in the distant bunkers, and the deeply slow, physical deterioration of the men forced to shovel it. Time is measured strictly in tons of fuel and inches of ice, an entirely physical, brutally heavy currency that is being spent with terrifying rapidity. The faint, completely static light from the suspended brass lantern highlights the deep, continuous layer of fine coal dust that has settled over absolutely every surface in the small room. The dust is entirely inescapable. It is the physical, dirty ghost of the engines that power their survival. It rests heavily upon the dark oak of the chart table, dulling the faint, remaining sheen of the old varnish. It coats the deep, intricate brass workings of the heavy telegraph, turning the golden metal into a muted, completely bruised bronze. It settles into the deep, frozen creases of the captain's heavy leather gloves, creating dark, gritty lines that perfectly trace the geography of his completely numb hands. In the context of a soft pastel drawing, this omnipresent coal dust acts as a unifying, highly textured layer of deep, smudged charcoal, blending all the distinct, separate elements of the wheelhouse into a single, cohesive, and deeply grim composition. It makes the cold look inherently dirty, giving the freezing air a heavy, physical grit that grates against the eyes and heavily coats the back of the dry throat. The captain slowly, deliberately blinks, feeling the microscopic, rough friction of the freezing dust against his swollen, heavy eyelids. The sensation is incredibly dry, entirely devoid of any lubricating moisture, a perfect, physical mirror of the utterly desiccated, frozen world outside. Beneath the thick, heavy floorboards, the agonizing, high-pitched shrieking of the iron hull against the unyielding ice slowly begins to change pitch once more. The sound deepens, dropping from a tearing scream into a low, completely guttural and structural roar. The immense, angled bow of the icebreaker has finally managed to bite deeply into the massive, submerged ridge of multi-year ice that has been halting their progress for the last several hours. The heavy deck beneath the captain's boots slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to tilt entirely upward. The change in the angle is incredibly slight, perhaps only a fraction of a single degree, but in the rigidly static, completely balanced world of the wheelhouse, it feels exactly like a massive, terrifying tectonic shift. The heavy brass lantern on its iron hook slowly, silently adjusts its hang, maintaining its perfect, absolute plumb line against the newly tilted ceiling. The shadows stretching across the deeply varnished mahogany bulkheads slowly elongate, shifting their heavy, dark geometry in perfectly silent response to the movement of the light. The captain leans slightly forward, instinctively compensating for the new incline of the deck, transferring his heavy, freezing weight entirely onto the balls of his numb feet. The physical strain of maintaining this new, unnatural posture immediately sends a dull, completely hollow ache shooting up through his rigid calves and into the heavy, stiffened joints of his knees. He does absolutely not adjust his stance further. He merely absorbs the new pain, filing it completely away into the vast, entirely unwritten ledger of the night's long suffering. The incredibly heavy, structural groaning of the ship reaches a terrifying, deafening crescendo. The deep vibration of the engines intensifies, rattling the thick glass in the heavy brass window frames with a frantic, desperate energy. The air inside the cabin feels suddenly, inexplicably pressurized, completely heavy with the immense, unseen forces doing brutal battle directly beneath them. And then, with a completely massive, echoing and entirely concussive boom, the thick ice ridge finally shatters. The sound is exactly like a heavy mountain actively tearing itself apart in the dark. The entire front half of the heavy iron ship drops violently forward, falling heavily into the newly created fissure in the frozen sea. The deck violently snaps back to level. The captain's heavy boots smack solidly against the dark oak floorboards. The suspended lantern swings exactly once, a short, incredibly jerky arc, before instantly settling back into total, unmoving stillness. The deep roar of the friction immediately subsides back into the continuous, boring and familiar grind of the hull crushing smaller blocks of ice beneath its immense weight. The ship surges forward entirely by perhaps 10 feet, a massive, incredibly significant victory measured only in microscopic, entirely meaningless inches. The completely static, heavily shaded world of the wheelhouse instantly returns to its slow, deeply rhythmic, and completely unvarying routine. The heavy engines thrum. The thick snow hisses against the glass. The dark compass card floats completely silently. The long, freezing history continues exactly as before, completely uninterrupted, entirely unfazed and boundlessly cold. The captain slowly lowers his right hand from the brass rail. The movement is incredibly stiff, deeply robotic. The thick, frozen leather of his glove loudly creaks exactly like ancient, dried wood. He brings the numb, heavy hand entirely to his side, letting it hang perfectly dead and perfectly useless against the incredibly thick wool of his coat. He stares completely blankly out of the small, highly frosted circle of clear glass, watching the pale, dusty beam of the searchlight continuously sweep over the newly broken, chaotic terrain of the ice. The absolute darkness instantly rushes in behind the sweeping light, swallowing the broken white slabs completely whole. There is absolutely no end to it. There is only the incredibly slow, heavily grinding, and perfectly monotonous advance into the absolute void. The deep, bruising cold continues to seep entirely into his bones. A slow, completely silent, and perfectly perfect freezing that requires absolutely nothing from him but his continued, unmoving, and entirely silent endurance. The pale, diffused cone of the forward searchlight continues its incredibly slow, entirely mechanical sweep across the newly fractured, deeply chaotic wasteland of the heavily packed ice. As the heavy, dusty beam of weak illumination passes slowly over the massive, violently jagged blocks of shattered frozen seawater, it briefly and starkly highlights their sharp, completely torn edges in blinding, transient flashes of pure, chalky white. But this incredibly harsh illumination is entirely fleeting, a completely temporary and ultimately futile theft of visual space from the crushing, overwhelming void. The absolute, bottomless, and incredibly heavy blackness of the Arctic night violently rushes back in directly behind the sweeping beam with a terrifying, almost liquid rapidity. It perfectly and completely swallows the broken, towering white slabs completely whole, instantly erasing their complex, deeply jagged geometry and returning them entirely to the deep, heavily textured and completely blank charcoal canvas of the unseen world. The incredibly long, deeply distorted shadows that are momentarily cast by these towering, broken monuments of ancient ice are not merely optical absences of light. They appear as heavy, strictly physical entities drawn in incredibly thick, aggressive strokes of pure, bruised indigo and flat, deeply matte black. They stretch out incredibly long across the flat, frozen expanse, moving and shifting with a slow, completely agonizing elasticity that perfectly and heavily mirrors the slow, grinding, and relentless advance of the iron hull. The overall visual effect is one of profound, entirely suffocating claustrophobia, a continuous, heavy, and completely dark drawing where the deep, heavy pastel strokes of the night are constantly, relentlessly, and perfectly overwriting the faint, struggling, and microscopic lines of pale white chalk. There is absolutely no distant horizon to anchor the exhausted, heavy eye. Absolutely no distant point of faint reference to provide even a microscopic sense of scale, distance, or forward progress. There is only the immediate, heavily frosted and completely freezing glass of the window pane, the rushing, continuous, horizontal stream of entirely abrasive snow, and the completely impenetrable, incredibly heavy wall of absolute darkness that sits heavily and permanently upon the freezing Black Sea. The incredibly heavy, completely numb, and deeply leather-clad hand of the captain hangs completely dead and perfectly motionless at his side, entirely useless and perfectly heavy against the incredibly thick, highly rigid, and completely freezing fabric of his dark naval greatcoat. The incredibly deep, profoundly bruising, and highly aggressive cold has long since entirely penetrated the heavy, tightly woven exterior layers of the stiffened wool, working its entirely invisible, heavily creeping way methodically through the dense, damp flannel shirts and the incredibly thick, scratchy woolen undergarments, until it finally came to rest permanently and heavily against his completely freezing, terribly pale skin. It is absolutely not a sharp, actively biting cold. It is an incredibly heavy, completely dull, and profoundly, deeply aching numbness that entirely and permanently replaces the basic human sensation of physical touch. When he slowly, mechanically, and completely deliberately draws a deep breath into his exhausted lungs, the heavy air is so completely entirely devoid of any residual thermal energy that it feels exactly and entirely like inhaling an incredibly thick, deeply granular, and highly abrasive slurry of crushed white ice and heavy, freezing iron dust. The freezing, entirely desiccated air harshly scrapes against the dry, completely cracked and deeply frozen surfaces of his nasal passages, burning a slow, completely agonizing, and completely cold trail down the very back of his entirely dry throat and deep into the heavy, deeply aching, and highly constricted cavity of his freezing chest. His heavy lungs, entirely exhausted by the sheer, continuous and highly draining physical effort of simply extracting microscopic amounts of oxygen from this entirely lethal, freezing environment, expand with a slow, deeply reluctant, and entirely mechanical heaviness. He holds the freezing, highly dense breath completely inside him for a long, perfectly still, and entirely silent moment, allowing the incredibly slow, failing, and deeply exhausted furnace of his own biological core to attempt to entirely vainly warm the invasive, freezing air. It is a completely microscopic, entirely silent, and deeply pathetic battle fought entirely with every single heavy respiration. A deeply futile struggle of a dying, completely isolated biological warmth actively pitted against the infinite, crushing, and completely apathetic weight of the polar void. When he finally, incredibly slowly, and completely heavily exhales, the incredibly thick, highly dense, and perfectly white plume of heavily freezing vapor rolls out entirely from between his painfully cracked lips, exactly like a heavy, slow-moving ghost of exhausted, freezing steam, seamlessly joining the permanent, faintly swirling and completely dusty mist that hangs perfectly and heavily suspended in the dark, entirely freezing corners of the deep cabin. Beneath his incredibly heavy, deeply felt-lined and completely frozen sea boots, the incredibly thick, entirely dark oak floorboards of the wheelhouse perfectly and completely maintain their continuous, deeply monotonous, and highly structural vibration. These heavy wooden planks are incredibly thick, perfectly cut from ancient, incredibly dense, and highly unyielding timber, yet they are entirely and completely subservient to the massive, heavily vibrating, and completely freezing iron deck plates that lie directly and invisibly beneath them. The natural grain of the thick wood, rendered completely and entirely invisible by decades of deeply ground-in, highly abrasive coal dust, and continuously freezing, highly pervasive moisture, functions exactly as a direct, completely unyielding, and entirely mechanical conduit for the deep, structural suffering of the massive steam engines located far below in the freezing dark. The heavy vibration is a completely low, incredibly heavily resonant, and completely bone-rattling thrum, a perfectly constant, entirely flat mechanical frequency that perfectly and seamlessly matches the deep, deeply groaning, and highly strained resonance of the massive steel hull, desperately pushing against the entirely unyielding ice. It is a highly physical sound that completely and entirely bypasses the frozen auditory canals and continuously registers directly within the heavy, freezing, and entirely aching marrow of the human skeleton. The captain continuously feels this heavy, entirely mechanical shivering, traveling incredibly slowly up through the highly stiffened, completely frozen joints of his heavy ankles, entirely and permanently numbing the heavy, tightly cramped muscles of his completely rigid calves, and perfectly settling into a deeply permanent, entirely completely hollow, and highly agonizing ache in his rigidly locked knees. The sheer, entirely unseen and highly draining physical energy required simply to stand perfectly upright and completely balanced on this constantly trembling, incredibly heavy, and completely freezing platform is entirely immense. A slow, highly continuous, and deeply methodical draining of his final, entirely meager, and completely exhausted reserves of basic human strength. He does absolutely not shift his heavy, freezing weight even a microscopic fraction of an inch to relieve the immense, highly crushing pressure. He simply and perfectly stands, a highly heavy, completely dark monument of heavily frozen wool, deeply stiffened leather, and completely unyielding, perfectly silent endurance, perfectly absorbing the entirely endless, highly mechanical, and deeply boring tremors of the dying, heavily freezing ship. The heavy, tumbling rumble of the fractured ice blocks scraping along the deep iron flanks of the ship is a continuous, unbroken auditory texture that entirely defines this specific, agonizingly slow phase of the endless night. The sound travels straight upward from the freezing black water, conducted flawlessly by the massive, heavily riveted steel plates of the thick hull. It is not a singular noise, but a complex, overlapping symphony of deep, grinding friction. Some of the broken ice slabs are as large as the ship's own upper superstructure. Ancient, multi-year monoliths of compacted snow and heavy, frozen seawater that have hardened over countless dark winters to the absolute density of pale granite. When these massive, heavily textured fragments are forcibly pushed against the dark iron sides by the ship's relentless forward momentum, the resulting scrape is a deafening, low-frequency groan that vibrates the cold teeth in the jaw and continuously shivers the heavy marrow in the bones. Other, smaller blocks, completely shattered into jagged, ragged pieces by the initial, concussive impact of the heavy bow, create a chaotic, continuous tumbling sound, exactly like thousands of tons of rough, heavy gravel being violently churned within a massive, rotating iron drum. If this heavy auditory landscape were meticulously translated to the strictly visual medium of the dark, rough canvas, it would appear as thick, continuous, horizontal streaks of rough, dirty gray and muted, heavy silver pastel violently dragged across the deep, bruised black background. The heavy, dark strokes would continuously overlap, actively creating a remarkably dense, physically impenetrable thicket of deeply abrasive texture, perfectly capturing the raw, relentless physical violence of the heavy iron ship, blindly forcing its incredibly slow way through the ruined, floating barricade. The captain feels every single microscopic variation in this deep, grinding symphony. He does not need to look out the highly frosted glass of the heavy window to know exactly what specific density of ice is currently punishing the dark hull. The thick, heavily felt-lined soles of his massive sea boots act as highly sensitive biological receptors, translating the subtle, continuous shifts in the thick oak floorboard's vibration into a highly detailed, entirely tactile map of the slow destruction occurring directly beneath him. He stands completely still, his incredibly heavy, deeply stiffened dark wool greatcoat hanging around his motionless frame like a freezing architectural shell, perfectly absorbing the deep, structural tremors. The sheer, immense physical energy required for the heavy steam engines to simply push these broken, floating mountains of heavy ice aside is nearly incomprehensible. Yet it is all entirely reduced to this dull, continuous, and deeply boring vibration in the incredibly cold, entirely sealed wooden box of the high wheelhouse. The agonizingly slow, deeply monotonous history of the frozen journey is written entirely in these heavy, unseen collisions. A dark, completely undocumented ledger of raw physical force pitted endlessly against absolute freezing resistance. Hanging perfectly plumb from its heavy iron hook directly above the dark oak chart table, the heavy brass storm lantern continues its slow, completely quiet, and perfectly desperate consumption of the thick, sweet-smelling oil. The incredibly tiny, faintly flickering flame within the thick, heavily soot-stained glass chimney is the absolute solitary source of warm illumination in the entirely dark, deeply freezing cabin. The brass reservoir at the heavy base of the lantern is completely cold to the touch, its once polished, highly reflective surface entirely dulled by a permanent, highly textured layer of deep, freezing condensation and fine, pervasive coal dust. Inside this heavy, cold brass bowl, the level of the dark, viscous oil is incredibly slowly, methodically dropping. It is a completely invisible, entirely silent countdown, a slow, mechanical bleeding of the tiny, artificial sun that weakly holds the crushing, bottomless shadows at bay. The captain's heavily exhausted, deeply sunken eyes slowly track the incredibly faint, dusty amber light as it completely fails to reach the upper, deeply shadowed corners of the thick timber ceiling. The light is so incredibly weak that it does not actively illuminate the room. It merely stains the edges of the absolute darkness with a pale, deeply sickly, and highly diluted wash of heavily muted yellow and bruised, dusty orange. The incredibly long, strictly geometric shadows cast by the heavy brass binnacle, the completely dormant engine order telegraph, and the motionless, completely dark silhouette of the heavy helmsman are absolute, possessing the exact same dense, physical weight and deep texture as the solid, heavy mahogany bulkheads themselves. These deep shadows are rendered entirely in the incredibly soft, highly thick strokes of pure black and deep indigo pastel, absorbing entirely whatever incredibly weak, transient light manages to strike them. Suspended perfectly and entirely within this weak, failing amber glow are the countless, microscopic, floating particles of fine, dark coal dust and deeply frozen moisture. They drift with an agonizingly slow, lethargic laziness, incredibly tiny, completely glittering motes of dark gray and pale white that visually give the freezing air a heavy, deeply granular, and entirely breathable texture. Every incredibly slow, heavily painful inhalation, the captain draws this deeply freezing, highly abrasive mixture directly down into his burning, exhausted lungs, perfectly coating the delicate, freezing tissues with a microscopic layer of the ship's own heavy, dark dirt, and the ocean's entirely killing cold. He is slowly, methodically internalizing the deeply freezing, heavy environment around him, becoming a quiet, physically living extension of the entirely frozen, deeply dark vessel. Far below the incredibly thick, highly freezing dark oak floorboards, completely separated from the absolute, crushing silence of the isolated wheelhouse by countless, entirely dark layers of heavy, freezing iron grating, thick steel bulkheads, and twisting, dark corridors. The massive, deeply roaring heart of the heavy icebreaker continues its desperate, completely blind struggle. The boiler rooms are a completely different, perfectly isolated world of absolute, incredibly violent and totally deafening mechanical chaos. Down in the absolute, lightless bottom of the deep hull, the air is not freezing, but incredibly, heavily and suffocatingly hot, thick with the deeply blinding, completely choking clouds of highly abrasive black coal dust, and the violently hissing, completely superheated escape of high-pressure steam. The unseen stokers, men reduced entirely to completely dark, heavily sweating silhouettes in the fierce, completely hellish orange glare of the open furnace doors, work with an incredibly desperate, entirely exhausting and highly frantic rhythm. They continuously, mechanically shovel the heavy, incredibly dense black coal directly into the roaring, deeply hungry fires, their entire physical existence dedicated entirely to the completely singular, deeply demanding task of maintaining the massive, incredibly heavy pressure in the giant, completely dark iron boilers. The completely unseen, incredibly heavy physical suffering of these deeply hidden men is the absolute, entirely fundamental requirement for the captain's own quiet, completely freezing and entirely motionless endurance directly above them. The incredibly intense, highly violent and entirely localized heat they desperately generate is instantly, immediately transferred entirely into the massive, deeply cold iron water tubes, violently boiling the heavy water into the completely invisible, entirely high-pressure steam that directly drives the incredibly massive, perfectly rhythmic thrust of the huge, deep iron pistons. These incredibly heavy pistons turn the massive steel propeller shafts, which finally push the angled, deeply heavy iron bow entirely against the incredibly unyielding, highly crushing pack ice. It is a deeply long, entirely complex, and completely heavily strained chain of pure, deeply brutal physical energy, beginning entirely in the deep, violently roaring, highly suffocating heat of the deep furnaces, and terminating perfectly in the incredibly slow, heavily grinding, completely silent crushing of the entirely deep, freezing Arctic ice directly outside the captain's highly frosted, incredibly freezing window. It is a machine designed to convert burning rock into forward inches, and it requires the slow, methodical sacrifice of human comfort to function.